The coup did not succeed, but its shockwave did. In the early hours of December, gunfire echoed briefly through Benin's political imagination, and then fell silent. The government held. The mutiny collapsed. Order was restored. Yet across West Africa, something shifted, because this was not just an attempted overthrow in a coastal state long considered stable. It was a moment that exposed the fault lines of a changing regional order, one stretching from the Sahel to the sea. Nigeria moved fast. ECOWAS reacted decisively. France offered quiet support. And then, almost immediately, another question surfaced. What did the Sahel alliance know? And what did it want? Whispers of connections, suspicions of influence, and unproven links began circulating. No conclusions, no verdicts. But in geopolitics, perception often matters before proof. At the center of that perception stood Burkina Faso, and the leadership that has come to symbolize a broader Sahelian defiance of inherited power structures. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the country has positioned itself not merely as a state reacting to pressure, but as one reshaping the language of sovereignty itself. Stay with us, because this was not only about Benin. It was about how far Sahelian power is believed to reach. This story is about fear and influence, about how alliances born in defense can be raided as forces of expansion, and about how a single failed coup revealed what many in the region are now asking in private. Is the Sahel alliance content to hold its ground, or is it being pushed into a role it never openly claimed? The answer matters, because in today's West Africa, what leaders intend is only part of the story. What others believe they intend may shape the next crisis before it even begins. The attempt was brief. Its consequences were not. In the early hours of the 7th of December, a small group of soldiers moved against the state in Benin. Their objective was audacious, their timing precise, and their calculation ultimately flawed. Within hours, the operation collapsed. Government buildings were retaken, loyalist forces reasserted control, the chain of command held. What might have spiraled into prolonged instability was contained before sunrise. On paper, it was a failed coup, but in West Africa, failed coups still speak. Benin had long been considered an exception in a region marked by repeated military takeovers. Its political order, though imperfect, was stable. Its institutions functioned. Its military remained largely outside partisan power struggles. That is precisely why the attempt resonated. Because when a state long seen as insulated experiences a rupture, however brief, it forces the region to ask harder questions. Not about success or failure, but about vulnerability. The response was immediate. Nigeria acted with speed, military support was mobilized, regional mechanisms activated. Signals were sent that constitutional order would be defended decisively and without hesitation. France, more quietly, provided assistance consistent with its recalibrated posture in the region, limited, discreet, and framed as support rather than command. The old architecture of West African crisis management snapped into place. And yet, even as the mutiny was neutralized, attention began drifting elsewhere. Investigators examined the networks behind the plot. Analysts scrutinized the profiles of the officers involved. And almost inevitably, questions emerged that reached beyond Benin's borders. Where had the plotters trained? Who had encouraged them? And who, if anyone, stood to benefit? No conclusions were announced. No evidence was made public. But the speculation itself became news. Reports noted that some figures associated with the attempt had prior links across the northern frontier. Commentators began drawing lines, cautiously, then more boldly, toward the Sahel, toward a region where coups had succeeded, alliances had hardened, and resistance to external pressure had become doctrine. This is where perception began to overtake fact. The Benin coup attempt did not prove the existence of an external hand, but it ignited a belief among officials, analysts, and neighboring states that the boundaries between Sahelian instability and coastal security were thinning. And belief in geopolitics alters behavior. For Benin, the episode was a warning, not just about internal dissent, but about its strategic position, wedged between a volatile Sahel to the north and an increasingly polarized regional order to the south. For the region, it was a reminder that stability is not static. It is contested, tested, and often challenged where it is least expected. The coup failed because the state reacted faster than the plotters anticipated, but the questions it raised lingered far longer than the gunfire, because the real story was not how the coup collapsed. It was why so many believed it pointed beyond Benin, and that belief would soon reshape how alliances, intentions, and threats were interpreted across West Africa. To understand why the Benin coup attempt triggered such anxiety, one must return to the structure that long defined West Africa's sense of order. For decades, regional stability rested on a familiar architecture. ECOWAS provided the political framework, Nigeria supplied the muscle, France offered strategic depth, intelligence, logistics, and reassurance from the background. It was not an equal system, but it was a predictable one. When constitutional order was threatened, ECOWAS spoke with authority. Sanctions followed quickly. Diplomatic pressure hardened into deadlines. And if persuasion failed, the possibility of force was never far from the table. This model was built on deterrence. The assumption was simple. Rapid, decisive action would prevent contagion. Coups would be isolated. Instability would be contained. And the cost of defiance would outweigh its appeal. For years this logic held, or appeared to. Nigeria, as the region's largest power, was indispensable. Its military capacity gave ECOWAS credibility. Its political weight turned resolutions into leverage. When Abuja moved, others followed. France, meanwhile, learned to operate with a lighter footprint. Where once it had intervened directly, it now supported indirectly, sharing intelligence, providing reconnaissance, and reinforcing partners willing to act. Presence became quieter, but influence remained. This was the old order at work. It framed security as enforcement, legitimacy as compliance, stability as something imposed quickly before alternatives could form. But the Sahel disrupted that equation. As coups succeeded in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the inherited system began to strain. Sanctions did not restore civilian rule. Pressure did not produce consensus. Instead, resentment hardened into resistance. When those states eventually withdrew from ECOWAS and formed a new alliance, it was more than institutional defiance. It was a rejection of the assumption that order must come from above, enforced by regional hierarchies and external backing. This rupture reshaped perception. By the time the Benin coup attempt unfolded, the region was already divided between those who defended the old architecture and those who openly questioned it. Trust between Sahelian states and coastal governments had thinned. Security incidents were no longer read in isolation, but through the lens of systemic rivalry. In that context, Benin mattered. A coastal state long aligned with ECOWAS, a partner comfortable within the inherited framework, a country whose stability validated the old order. The rapid response to the coup attempt was therefore not only about Benin, it was about reaffirmation. Nigeria's swift action signaled that deterrence still had teeth. France's discreet support suggested continuity without spectacle. ECOWAS demonstrated that its reflexes remained intact. Together they sent a message. The old architecture was still standing. Yet the very speed of that response also revealed its vulnerability. Because deterrence depends on credibility, and credibility depends on belief. As soon as observers began linking the coup attempt, however tentatively, to the Sahelian sphere, the crisis took on a second meaning. It was no longer just about defending a government. It was about defending a system. The old order had reasserted itself, but under pressure. Its tools were familiar, its logic unchanged. What had shifted was the environment in which it now operated, one where alternatives existed and where resistance to enforcement had already proven durable. This tension lay beneath every decision taken after the coup attempt, not simply whether order could be restored, but whether it could still be defined the same way. Because when an architecture must constantly prove itself through force, its foundations are already being tested, And that is where the next question emerged. If the old order was still powerful, why did so many fear what lay beyond it? The most consequential shift did not take place on the battlefield. It took place in perception. When the Sahel Alliance was formed, its stated purpose was defensive. It was framed as a response to sanctions, isolation, and the threat of external intervention. A pact born not of expansion, but of survival. For its members, the message was clear. Sovereignty would be protected, borders defended, and pressure resisted collectively. But perception rarely remains confined to intention. The failed coup in Benin became a lens through which the Sahel Alliance was reinterpreted, not as a shield, but as a shadow, not merely holding ground, but potentially extending influence, whether deliberately or by circumstance. This distinction mattered, because even without evidence of direct involvement, the appearance of connection altered the strategic environment. Investigations raised questions, media narratives drew lines, and regional officials began recalibrating assumptions. What had changed was not what the Sahel Alliance had done, but how it was now read. In West Africa's current climate, proximity itself carries meaning. Borders are porous. Military cultures overlap. Officers train together, defect, return, and retain networks that outlive formal command structures. Against this backdrop, the idea that a coup attempt in a coastal state could be mentally linked to Sahelian power centers was not irrational. It was symptomatic of a region where instability has traveled north to south before, and where many fear it could do so again. This is where leadership became symbolic. In public discourse, Burkina Faso increasingly stands as the face of Sahelian defiance, not because it commands the alliance alone, but because its posture has been the most explicit. Its rhetoric is firm, its decisions are visible, its rejection of inherited hierarchies is unapologetic. Under Ibrahim Traoré, that posture has been interpreted by some as a declaration of autonomy, and by others as an invitation to challenge the existing order. The difference between those readings is profound. One sees defense, the other sees ambition. Yet neither reading requires intent to have effect, because in geopolitics, influence is often assigned before it is exercised, and once assigned, it shapes reactions. Governments hedge. Alliances tighten. Red lines are drawn earlier, closer, and with less margin for error. The Benin episode accelerated this process. Suddenly, the Sahel Alliance was no longer discussed only in the context of its member states. It was discussed as a factor in regional balance, a variable to be accounted for by coastal governments, security planners, and external partners alike. This was the real shift, not from defense to offense in a practice, but from defense to influence in imagination. And imagination has power. It drives policy, it narrows tolerance, it hardens preemptive logic. For the Sahel Alliance, this posed a dilemma it did not choose but could not ignore. Remain silent and risk having intentions defined by others. Respond forcefully and risk confirming fears of expansion. Between these poles lies a narrow corridor, one where posture must be managed as carefully as policy. The Benin coup attempt pushed the alliance into that corridor, whether it intended to step there or not. Because once an alliance is perceived as capable of shaping events beyond its borders, restraint becomes as strategic as strength. And this was the moment when the Sahel Alliance ceased to be judged solely by what it did, and began to be judged by what others believed it might do next. That belief would shape the reactions of neighboring states, and those reactions in turn would define the next phase of the region's unfolding story. The most immediate impact of the Benin coup attempt was not military, it was psychological. Across the coastal states bordering the Sahel, a quiet recalculation began. Governments that had long viewed instability as a northern problem, distant, containable, and buffered by geography, were forced to confront a more unsettling possibility, that the fault lines were moving. For Benin, the shock cut deep. The country had positioned itself as a pillar of continuity, politically stable, institutionally intact, and firmly anchored within the regional order. The attempted coup fractured that self-image. It exposed vulnerabilities within the security apparatus and revived an old fear that unrest, once unleashed in the Sahel, does not respect borders. This anxiety did not remain domestic. In neighboring capitals, the episode was read as a warning. If a state long considered resilient could be shaken, then no coastal government could assume immunity. Military dissatisfaction, porous borders, and shared threat environments suddenly looked less abstract. The response was predictable and consequential. Security cooperation intensified, intelligence sharing deepened, ties with established regional and external partners were reinforced. The logic was defensive, but the effect was polarizing. On one side of the emerging divide stood states reaffirming faith in the inherited security architecture, rapid response, collective enforcement, and external backing as guarantees of order. On the other stood a Sahelian bloc that had already rejected those premises, emphasizing sovereignty, resisting coercion, and building parallel mechanisms of coordination. The space between these positions narrowed. What made the moment particularly volatile was the role of a perception. Coastal governments did not need proof of Sahelian involvement in the Benin attempt to feel exposed. Suspicion alone was sufficient to harden policy, and once policy hardens, dialogue becomes riskier. This is how polarization begins, not through declarations of hostility, but through defensive alignment. Each side acts to reduce uncertainty, and in doing so, increases it for the other. For the Sahel alliance, this dynamic was especially perilous. If it remained silent, others would divine its intentions. If it pushed back rhetorically, it risked validating fears of expansion. Either choice carried cost. Meanwhile, the old order found renewed purpose. The rapid containment of the coup attempt was held up as evidence that enforcement still works, that deterrence still matters. For those invested in that system, Benin became proof that vigilance must be maintained, and pressure applied early. Yet this reaffirmation came with a price. As regional politics lead toward binary alignment, nuance thinned. Crises were no longer treated as discrete events, but as indicators of systemic struggle. Every incident became symbolic. Every response, a signal. The danger here is not confrontation by design. It is confrontation by accumulation. As coastal states lean further into security partnerships and the Sahel consolidates its own bloc, the region risks drifting into a posture where misinterpretation is constant and trust is scarce. The buffer zones shrink. The margin for error tightens. The Benin coup attempt did not create this trajectory, but it accelerated it, and in doing so, it transformed the localized shock into a regional inflection point, one that revealed how fragile the balance has become and how quickly anxiety can reshape alliances. The question now is not whether polarization exists, it is whether it can still be managed. Because once fear becomes policy, reversing course is never easy. At the edge of every shift lies a choice. For the Sahel alliance, the aftermath of the Benin coup attempt has sharpened a dilemma it did not formally announce, but cannot escape. The alliance now exists not only as a pact of mutual defense, but as a presence others must factor into their security calculations. That visibility brings risk. The first is strategic overreach, even without intent. If the alliance is perceived as expanding influence beyond its borders, reactions will follow. Coastal states will harden alliances. Regional mechanisms will reassert themselves with greater urgency. External partners will read Sahelian moves through a lens of containment rather than cooperation. In such an environment, restraint can be misread as concealment and silence as complicity. The second risk is entrapment by narrative. Once an alliance is cast as a destabilizing force, it begins to operate under suspicion. Every crisis becomes circumstantial evidence. Every coincidence, a pattern. This dynamic narrows diplomatic space and incentivizes preemptive postures on all sides. The danger is not what the Sahel alliance does, it is what others assume it might do. Yet the alternative path carries its own cost. To actively counter these perceptions, the alliance would need to communicate, to clarify boundaries, signal limits, and emphasize defensive intent. that requires a level of transparency and coordination that young alliances often struggle to sustain, especially under pressure. It also risks exposing internal differences, because restraint must be collective to be credible. One misaligned message, one ambiguous action can undermine an entire posture of caution. This is where the horizon opens. If the Sahel Alliance chooses self-limitation, focusing inward, consolidating security, and avoiding entanglement beyond its core, it may preserve autonomy at the cost of influence. It would reduce immediate friction, but remain vulnerable to being defined by others. If it leans into visibility, shaping narratives, engaging selectively, and asserting its role in regional debates, it risks confrontation, but gains agency over how it is perceived. Neither option offers safety, but one offers authorship. The lesson of the Benin episode is not that expansion is inevitable or that restraint is weakness. It is that ambiguity has become expensive. In a polarizing region, silence creates space for fear to grow. For the Sahel Alliance, the next phase will be less about territory and more about signaling, less about strength and more about judgment. How it chooses to act or not act will shape whether it is seen as a stabilizing counterweight or an unpredictable variable. The future of West Africa may hinge on that distinction, because alliances do not only shape security by what they enforce, they shape it by what they choose not to provoke. And in a region already stretched thin by suspicion and memory, knowing where to stop may be the most strategic decision of all. The Benin coup attempt failed quickly, but the questions it unleashed will not disappear so easily. What lingered after the gunfire fell silent was not proof, but perception. And in West Africa today, perception is power. It shapes alliances, accelerates fear, and hardens policy long before facts are settled. This is why the episode mattered far beyond Benin. It exposed a region no longer governed by a single logic of order. The inherited system, built on rapid enforcement and external backing, still responds with force and speed. But alongside it now stands a Sahelian bloc that has rejected coercion and insists on sovereignty as its organizing principle. Between these two visions lies a widening gap. For many coastal states, the fear is contagion, that instability from the Sahel could spill south, eroding institutions once thought secure. In that fear, even unproven links take on weight. Even silence becomes suspicious. For the Sahel Alliance, the challenge is different. It is not only defending territory, but managing interpretation. An alliance born in resistance now finds itself read as influence. A shield is mistaken for a spear. This is the paradox at the heart of the moment. The alliance may not seek expansion, but it is being treated as if it might. Here, leadership becomes decisive. Under figures like Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has come to symbolize a broader Sahelian refusal to accept inherited hierarchies. To supporters, this is dignity reclaimed. To critics, it is disruption in the making. Both readings coexist, and both drive behavior. The future, then, hinges less on intent than on restraint, on whether the Sahel Alliance chooses to clarify its limits, shape its narrative, and reduce the space for fear, or whether ambiguity continues to define it by default. Expansion is not inevitable, nor is isolation, but in a polarized region, neutrality is fragile, and silence is rarely neutral. The lesson of Benin is not that the Sahel is reaching outward. It is that the region is watching more closely than ever, ready to project meaning onto every movement, every crisis, every pause. What the Sahel Alliance really wants may be simple: survival, sovereignty, and respect. Whether it is granted the chance to pursue those goals without being pulled into a cycle of suspicion and counter-alignment will shape the next chapter of West Africa's story. Because the most dangerous conflicts are not born from ambition alone. They are born when fear outruns understanding. And in a region already stretched by history, the line between defense and division has never been thinner. This is not the end of the story. It is the moment when its direction will be decided.